current Treasurer's authorised biography. Fast forward to the last election and Labor's defeat, and MUP thought perhaps it was time to reopen discussions. Again, the courtship was rather more drawn out than we enthusiastic publishers prefer, but we prevailed, thankfully. Our case was this, that Greg Combet's story is an argument for political and civic engagement. It's an argument for social justice, for the enduring importance of the trade union movement and for the value of reform. We wanted Greg to write about his involvement in a succession of campaigns, from the Ansett dispute, the waterfront dispute, through to the Rights at Work campaign. His 6 years in parliamentary politics would be covered, but the focus of this memoir was to be an account of a life committed to improving the lives of Australian working people. He finally allowed himself to be persuaded that the project was worthwhile. With the encouragement and support of his co-author Mark Davis, the book was completed in the kind of efficient manner in which Greg manages his own working life. You who know Greg well will know that his attention to detail is pretty comprehensive. Negotiating a contract with a former secretary of the ACTU certainly taught us much that we did not know about contract law. It was in fact more entertaining than the time we negotiated with Peter Costello, who looked at his contract and said, "Why GST?" And all I could say was, "Could you ask the former Treasurer?" But to return to Greg Combet, the author of The Hour, the courtship was extended, but it was also enjoyable, and there was the vital matter of red wine that George Wright has already alluded to. But the most entertaining period in the publishing process was the task of agreeing on the title. Greg, Mark, Jacinta, Sally Heath, our publisher, and myself debated the title for far longer than the quantum of the modest advance. And I offer you as Exhibit A the folder devoted to Combet book titles. We considered, here it is, the titles, and none of them are available to prospective and incoming memoirists. We've got them all cornered. The titles were included: The Dispute Whisperer, A Fair Away, Here to Stay, Fair Game, Left for Good. I thought that was great myself. A Progress Principle, A Man with a Mission, Articles of Faith, Just Cause, Left Field, Taking Care of Business, For My Part, Combet's Way. We had a long discussion about Combet's Way. The Pursuit of Fairness, The Rights of Us, One for All, Fair Go, A Life's Work, On Purpose, A True Believer, Labour for Life, From the Coalface, Into the Fray, Fighting Chance. I could go on, there are more here. But finally, the fights of my life seemed to say all that was required. The struggles, the contribution, the sense of belonging to a worthy cause, of being on the right side of history, and the hope of making a difference. It has been an enormous pleasure to work with Greg and his co-author Mark Davis on this project. I'm pleased that we managed to persuade him that this book was worth doing, because it shows us why a life in politics matters. In the current climate of an utterly debased and degraded political culture, where politicians twerk, don tutus, or discuss their lack of a sex life in search of media attention, the steadfast purpose and conviction shown by Greg Combet becomes all the more valuable. Please join me in welcoming him to the microphone.
Thanks very much, Louise. In fact, after that list of prospective titles, I had a private favourite, that is Adlerised. Because she's pretty persistent, and I was pretty reticent about doing a book, particularly while a parliamentarian, because I think that books like that are interpreted that way. And, but ultimately, I wanted to do a book so that the work that the Labor movement does can be evidenced. You know, the Labor movement is the longest, oldest, most constructive institution in this country. It goes way back, way back. And Mark and I ultimately took the book on to try and illustrate that. But the Labor movement, I think the Sydney Trades and Labour Council started in 1870, but you can go right back to the convict period, when convicts were lashed, given extra penal servitude, rations taken away from them if they tried to combine to join together to collectively bargain for a little increase in pay or an increase in their rations. That's what happened to the early union organisers. And through the early part of the 19th century, unions started to emerge in this country, which has been a tough and brutal country for so many people, not least of which the Indigenous population, who've had to wait 180 odd years before in their own land they achieved recognition as citizens. This has been a very tough country for a lot of people. And without the labour movement and its values, fighting for fairness, fighting for justice, fighting for equality of opportunity, for decent treatment, for respect, for just treatment, for improvements in the law, for democratic rights. Without the labour movement, this would be a very different country indeed. The labour movement, through the unions and ultimately the Labor Party, has established those values in our laws, in our institutions, in our culture and in our society. And there's been countless thousands of people over those generations who've contributed in that way. And ultimately, me and many of us here, of course, who've worked all our working lives for the labour movement, we're just one person amongst generations and countless thousands who've contributed to that and the nature of the society and the economy that we have today. And I know it sounds, well, it always seemed to me a bit that if you do a book, it's a bit conceited perhaps, but ultimately I hope you don't judge me too harshly in that respect. I've just wanted to try and record what people I've worked with in the time of my working life, what they've been able to contribute, and I thank you for that. So I should make a few acknowledgements, I think. And firstly to my family. Many of my family members are here today, but particularly my mum and my sister, and also to Greg Withers, who's effectively a member of my family. We've been friends since we were 4 years old. We've exceeded half a century. Now, we all started in Rooty Hill, and they've supported me over many years and many difficult struggles, and I immensely appreciate it. But my partner Juanita is here, my daughter Anna, and all of my other family members, thanks so much for coming and for everything you've done for me over a long period of time. Julia and George, thank you so much for your wonderful and very generous comments about me and my contribution. I appreciate it tremendously. George and I worked together for a long period of time. Many of the fights in this book are George's fights too, as is the case with many people in the room. All of my friends who are here, thanks so much. To many of my staff from the ACTU and in my parliamentary period are here, and thank you so much for all the support and everything you've done for me. All of my working colleagues, thank you. Thanks to Mark Lennon and Unions New South Wales, who've given us the opportunity to come here today. This is very important for me, to be able to launch this book in a union venue, and I appreciate it a lot. Dave Oliver, a successor of mine at the ACTU, is here too, and as are many other people. My parliamentary colleagues, some still in Parliament, some not in Parliament anymore. What wonderful times we had. It's such hard work, and the relationships you form are therefore very enduring. Wayne and I work together on quite a few economic issues, and I enormously appreciate you being here today. Thanks, Wayne. And there's another Deputy PM here too, ex-Deputy PM, Anthony Albanese. And Anthony I've known since university days. You go through a lot in lives together, and the period in Parliament was tremendously formative for me. I learnt a lot, and I appreciate it tremendously. So thanks very much to all of you for coming. Bob Hawke has been a feature of my life since I was a kid. My old man used to be wandering around the winery all the time, saying Bob Hawke will be Prime Minister one day. Bob Hawke will be Prime Minister one day. So go with that Bob Hawke, And we listened to the news reports of Bob's success in winning the presidency of the ACTU in 1969 at the Paddington Town Hall. And it was a big deal. It was a new breath of air in the trade union movement and in the Labor Party. Gough Whitlam was around and had that success in the 69 election with a big swing to Labor, and it was a feature of my life. And can you imagine how important it is for me that Bob and Blanche is here today? after that lifetime of experience. When I took over at the ACTU and was elected to replace Bill Kelty, who was a titan, the greatest trade union official we've ever had in this country, I think. No offence, Bob, you're a great Prime Minister. But Bob was on the plane down to Melbourne as soon as I asked him to give me a hand to sort a few things out at the ACTU about its assets and its history, because basically Bob Hawke built the ACTU, its assets, in his time as president, and made it a strong organisation through a few initiatives. Some of you might recall here, the Burke Store and ACTU Jet Set Travel and Solo and a few other things. But he was always there to help me. So thank you very much to everyone. You know, in a general sense, there are many people here I'd like to thank, and I'll say a couple of more things about a few individuals in a minute. But it's about the labour movement and the values that I spoke about, and the history and tradition of the labour movement in this country and what it's been able to do for people. The book, of course, in the pre-publicity, attracts a lot of attention about the parliamentary period, in particular the conversations that Julie and I had towards the end of the Gillard government. But in truth, the parliamentary period's a fairly small part of the book, but nonetheless a very important one. And I'd like to note a few things of achievements from that period, because we had so much crap heaped upon us during that period in government that it obscured tremendous Labor achievements. You know, one of the... I personally think that the response of the government to the global financial crisis was an absolutely outstanding success and of tremendous, tremendous benefit to this country and the people within it, and to many people, hundreds of thousands of people who would have lost their jobs. And I hope and anticipate that Wayne will deal with that issue in some length in his book, as I'd anticipate Julia might mention spare a word or two on it. And they deserve great credit. Kevin Rudd, Wayne Swan, Julia Gillard and Lindsay Tanner in particular deserve tremendous credit for what they did for the country during that period of time. And it was not... There was nothing irresponsible about a Keynesian expansion in Commonwealth expenditure to keep people in jobs and to keep the economy growing when every other advanced economy was in recession. Nothing irresponsible about that. And in subsequent years, as the economy was growing, we're undertaking, and Wayne was making very hard calls, and Julia, fiscal consolidation, reining the budget in a way that was compassionate towards people in the community. Not like the budget we have just seen. There is no debt and deficit disaster in this country, and there is no need to be making the painful cuts that are being made that are hurting so many people in the community. It's simply a statement of their values, as our budget was a statement of our values, and it's another cause to fight. You know, when bad things are done, you've got to fight. And that's one of the messages out of my book. You know, I've been meeting people in the street. Oh, it's that terrible Abbott government. Oh, there's a budget and there's all cuts. I just say, stand up and fight. No point moaning about it all. You've got to stand up, join together and bring about change. But there are many other great things that were done. Peter Garrett's here, and former Environment Minister and Education Minister, had the opportunity to be involved in tremendous environmental reforms, and along with Julia's leadership, the wonderful changes to education that really, I think, were the centrepiece of the Gillard government period. Well, you know, the most important thing you can do for people to give them a chance in life is to give them a quality of access to education, to ensure they've got a chance to advance themselves, to realise their own capacity and contribute to the society and the economy by affording them education. Again, it was a statement of our values. And again, you look at the recent budget and it's all about cutting access to education. Dreadful things. It's again You know, you're wandering around looking for something to fight for. Fight. You know, you've got to stand up for what you believe in, stand up for the values that you have, for equality of access to education, and fight for it. And none of these things were easy to bring about as reforms during our period in government. But there are numerous positive things, and I think with the production of the memoirs that are going to be coming forth in the next few months in particular, I hope that you take the time to consider not just buying my book, but buy Julia's, buy Pete's, buy Wayne's and buy everyone else's, and have a good read. I had to get out first, you'd understand why. There's a bit of competition there, but it's important to consider it and to look at the period in a proper context, as Julia was encouraging. But of course, as I said, that's not a major part of my book. My book's really about my life in the union movement. And if I've got anything to say to anyone to thank, it's to thank the union movement. Every opportunity and every privilege I've had to be involved in anything, including going to Parliament, is because of the trade union movement and the people in the unions who supported me. Tony Mars here. My first union was the Coal Miners Union, the Miners' Federation, and I went on to the Waterside Workers' Federation, of course, just next door in the 1980s. Both of those unions have supported me throughout my career, and I have so much gratitude for what was done for me, because you can't do anything without that sort of institutional support. And we fought the waterfront dispute in 1998. You saw a few clips from it just then. You know, it's different than parliamentary life. Trade union disputes like that are bare knuckle, knock them out, drag them down and kick them when they're down. There's no quarter given or asked. But if you're in a dispute like that, there was no other person you would want to be standing next to than John Coombs, one of my greatest friends. A great, great friend, a wonderful person, and it was a bloody hard dispute, wasn't it, John? But we won. We won. The MUA's still here, I notice. Paddy's here. Yeah, now the MUA's still around. Where's Peter Reith gone? Where's Chris Corrigan? They're gone. That's what I used to say on the picket line. They'll be gone. How to be gone. The MUA will still be here. And that's the test of it, and we won it by fighting hard. Ansett, of course, was a major thing. George mentioned that earlier. But the most emotionally difficult fight that I've been in is the James Hardie dispute. And Karen Banton's up the back, Bernie's widow. Oh, Christ, that was difficult doing that. That company, of course, left the country, took its assets, put them overseas, headquartered in the Netherlands, all their activities in the US, to leave people to die here without compensation, notwithstanding that they'd known for 70 years that they were killing people. You know, and you can't accept that injustice, and you have to fight against it. And didn't the union movement stand up and fight? And we brought them to justice. And now, as chronicled in the book, they're paying their compensation to people who unfortunately are still contracting asbestos diseases, and we established a compensation fund that if the company continues to be profitable in the United States, will unfortunately have the job, but at least it's there, of compensating people for maybe the next 40 or 50 years. The biggest personal injury settlement that any of us knew of internationally. And thank you, Karen, for all that you put into it, and thanks so much for Bernie. There's a few other fights in there, but one I'd just like to mention, if you'll indulge me, and that's carbon pricing. Something everyone loves. No, this was a very difficult public policy reform, and a lot of my staff are here, my former ministerial staff, and boy, they worked so hard on that policy reform. And I want to say in particular to them, but to people more generally, you know, it's no more than a setback, in my opinion, what's occurred with the repeal of the laws that we put through no more than a setback, because great reforms like that have to be fought for time and time again. But they are the right thing to do. The empirical evidence mounts. We know we've got to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and ultimately all of the work that we did will return, because if you're making a reform of that nature, you've got to find the most economically efficient, environmentally effective and socially fair way of enacting it. And that is the reform that we made. That is the reform that we made. We lost the politics, yes, and I bear substantial responsibility for that. But I am absolutely, emphatically convinced that we had the right policy stance. An emissions trading scheme is the best way for us to contribute to international action to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Mark and I were talking last week and he pointed to me some new data that's come out from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that reported just last month that June was the 352nd month when global temperatures were above the 20th century average. The last below average month was in February 1985. And it's just another little piece of evidence. And a government and a Prime Minister that denies science and empirical evidence is never going to have a sustainable policy or political position. But again, nothing will happen to tackle climate change in this country by magic. No one's going to walk around and sprinkle something and it'll all fall into place. It has to be fought for. If you believe it's right, you've got to fight for it. And in any way I can contribute, along with, of course, all of my colleagues, former colleagues, will contribute to fighting for it. And I encourage the Labor movement more generally, never give up on this issue. We were right to do what we did, despite all the toxic politics and the shit we had to put up with from News Corporation and many others, and all the populist, irresponsible, opportunist crap that Tony Abbott goes on about. We were right. And we've got to push forward and make that reform in years to come. And I've been tremendously heartened by Labor's position and Bill Shorten's personal commitment that he's made to continuing to have an ETS as a policy, because it means it will be a difficult fight at the next election. But we've got to rise up, get behind him, get behind Labor, get behind that position. Don't be seduced by the Greens. The Greens have wrecked action on climate change numerous times. They voted with Abbott in 2009 to defeat an ETS. We've got to stop being seduced by them. Get behind a proper policy position and win the politics. So as you can see, I've got a little bit of fight left in me. Not quite sure how to use it. I'm feeling a lot better. But, I just hope that the book encourages some people to become involved, and particularly young people to be involved in the trade unions and the wider Labor movement. There's a lot to do, still. If you believe in those values, try and make the place a republic after all this time. I remember Bob talking about that in the 60s. It's time we got on with things like that, with an Australian head of state. Personally, I don't like having the Union Jack on the Australian flag. I know a few people might disagree with it, but I don't like it. Maybe some others don't like it too. The Constitution should properly reflect the fact and actuality of Aboriginal occupation of this land. There's a few social causes too. I make a few observations about voluntary euthanasia, and that's one of my passions, I guess, that I'd like to see reforms on that front. I appreciate people have different views about all of that, and I don't disrespect it, but that's one thing would motivate me. Same-sex marriage in the same sort of category, social reforms and many others. But unless it's the Labor movement, the trade unions and the Labor Party working together to drive that forward, it ain't ever going to get there. And for it to be effective, I reckon it is time for us to modernise a bit. And I do, of course, every parrot in a pet shop's got a view about what should happen to the Labor Party-union relationship. Well, I'm no different. I had a view about it too. I just think the relationship needs to be democratised. You know, there's 1 million people who are members of trade unions affiliated to the Labor Party. And I know from all the research we did over many years, the majority of them vote Labor. Hundreds of thousands of people who are members of affiliated trade unions vote Labor. And they're normal people. They're not political apparatchiks, you know, factional heavies. They're normal people. They're nurses, teachers, shop assistants, miners, factory workers, production workers. They're people from all parts of the community, in different parts of the workforce. Give them a say. Give them a say. You could bring in hundreds of thousands of Labor-supporting people who are in an affiliated trade union to the Labor Party pretty quickly. And that way, through democratising the Labor Party, creeps like Eddie Obeid will not be able to control it, will not be able to abuse the Labor movement, you know, in a way for personal gain. I think by democratising it, we can really reclaim it and restore it to being a large mass-based organisation along with the branch membership. So the debate on the weekend at the State Labor Conference is fantastic, I think. Doesn't matter if everything doesn't get through at this point in time, but nonetheless, people like John and many others fighting for change, you know, eventually will break through and we'll have a much wider-based, more democratic, you know, closer to the community Labor Party in the future, and that'll be key to realising the Labor movement's goals. Thanks very much for coming. You do me a tremendous privilege being here today. I really do appreciate it, and thanks very much.